The next thing was to decide as to the best route for the return march, and Ariaeus was of opinion that it would be better not to return by the way they had come. "If we go that way," he said, "we cannot fail to perish from hunger, for even on the journey hither we have often been short of food, and in those places where food was plentiful we have already taken all that was to be had. I think I can show you a better way, which, though longer, goes through fruitful districts. But for the first few days we must make long forced marches, so as to get at least 2 or 3 days' journey in advance of the great king. He will give up the idea of pursuing us, for he would not venture to come after us with a small army, and with a great army, which must of necessity move slowly, he would not be able to overtake us." Early the next morning, therefore, the allied forces started together for some villages in which they were to encamp for the night. They were still on the march when, towards evening, they perceived by various signs that the king's troops were not far off. Clearchus did not wish for an engagement, for his men were tired and hungry, having had nothing to eat all day, but, in order that he might not seem to be afraid of them, he went on marching in the same direction as before. The enemy did not, however, appear in sight, and the Hellenes reached the villages for which they were bound, without any fighting. But on arriving at the place, they found that the king's soldiers had been there and had destroyed everything. They had not even stopped short of burning down the houses. The first comers were able to make themselves fairly comfortable, but the rear, who did not get until after dark, were obliged to lie down upon the bare ground, without food or shelter. The discomfort gave rise to quarrels among the soldiers, and there was so much noise and confusion that those at a distance were seized with panic, thinking that the enemy had surprised them in the darkness. Thus the night passed in wretchedness and anxiety, but in the morning Clearchus invented a joke as a means of reassuring the disheartened soldiers. He sent for a herald and told him to go around the camp, proclaiming that whoever would give information as to the person who had let the ass into the camp should receive a talent of silver. By this joke, the soldiers understood that Clearchus meant to laugh at them for their fright and to assure them that there had been no real cause for it. Meanwhile, the king was by no means at ease, for he was quite as much afraid of the Hellenes as they of him, and in the morning he again sent heralds to them. He did not now attempt to demand that they should give up their arms, but proposed to make a treaty with them. When the heralds were announced, Clearchus was very careful not to let it appear that the Hellenes were in any pressing need or that they felt their position to be a difficult one. The heralds were told that they must wait until he could find time to attend to them, and meanwhile he drew up his troops in such a manner as to make the best possible display, putting in front those who had complete sets of armor and who could otherwise appear to the greatest advantage. This done, he went forward with the other generals to receive the heralds and asked, rather curtly, what they wanted. When they had delivered their message, he answered, "Say to the king that another battle will be necessary before we can think about a treaty. For we have nothing to eat, and I cannot speak to my men about a treaty until their hunger is stayed." The heralds rode away, but quickly returned, which proved that the king was near at hand. They brought with them guides and said that, in case the Hellenes were willing to agree to a truce, they were to conduct them to a place where food could be obtained. Clearchus and the other generals withdrew to consider this proposal, and they very quickly decided to conclude the truce at once. But nevertheless they again kept the heralds waiting for some time, so that it might appear as if it had been a good while before they could make up their minds to agree to the king's proposals. At last, the decision was communicated to the heralds, and the two armies set out under the direction of the king's guides, marching by a road which was one of the very worst that the Hellenes had ever seen. The district through which they were passing was part of the province of Babylonia and was crossed in all directions by an infinite number of canals and ditches which kept the country well watered, and made it abundantly fruitful. At this time of year they were not usually full of water, but, in order to make the march as difficult as possible for the Hellenes, the Persians had opened all the sluices. Consequently, the canals could not be crossed except by bridges, of which there were none. The barbarians had been anxious to give the Hellenes a practical example of the endless difficulties that they might expect to meet with in the course of their retreat. But if they hoped that this would have the effect of making them humble and ready to submit, they were much mistaken. Clearchus was not the man to be beaten by a difficulty of this sort, and under his direction the Hellenes set cheerily to work to make temporary bridges wherever they were required. In many places, fallen trunks of date palms lay ready to hand, and where these did not suffice, others were quickly felled. All soldiers under the age of 30 years were ordered to the work, in order that it might be carried through as fast as possible. Clearchus himself acted as overseer, moving about briskly among the soldiers with a staff in the right hand and a spear in the left, and, whenever he saw a man loitering over his task, he did not hesitate to give him a beating. Although he was more than 50 years old, he labored with his own hands with the utmost diligence, and this example was followed by many other of the older men. At last, the toil was over, and the Hellenes reached some villages where a little money could buy food in abundance. Inexhaustible seemed the immense stores of corn, dates, and palm wine, as well as of a kind of acid drink made also from the date palm, which they found in these villages. The food, moreover, was as good as it was plentiful. Dates better than any that the Hellenes had ever eaten at home were here food for slaves. Those put aside for the masters were of immense size and exquisite flavor. Delicious too was the sweet juice of the date palm, but unhappily it was apt to give headache. In this district the Hellene army encamped, together with their barbarian allies. For 2 days they heard nothing of the enemy, but on the 3rd day Tissaphernes arrived with a brother-in-law of the great king and 3 other Persian noblemen, attended by many slaves. Tissaphernes demanded an interview with the Hellene generals, and, when they had presented themselves, he began to address them in a friendly manner by means of an interpreter who understood both Persian and Hellene speech. "You know," said Tissaphernes, "that I am the nearest neighbor of your country, and, as I see that you are now in great straits, I am anxious to obtain the permission of the great king to conduct you to your homes in safety. By so doing I hope not only to gain your gratitude, but also that of all Hellas. The king knows and values the services I have rendered him. I was the first to bring him news of the revolt of Cyrus and the only one who did not fly before you in the battle. He has promised me, therefore, to grant my request on your behalf, but at the same time he desires me to ask you for what reason you have taken the field against him. As your friend, I advise you to be careful in giving your answer, that I may not fail in my endeavor to help you." After conferring with the other generals, Clearchus answered, "We knew not that Cyrus intended to lead us against the great king. But when he who had shown us much kindness was in need of our help, we should have been shamed before gods and men had we then deserted him. Cyrus is now dead, and we have no further quarrel with the king nor any wish to injure his subjects. If we are allowed to go on our way in peace, we will return quietly to our home, and, for any kindness that we may receive, we shall prove ourselves grateful. But if we are treated as enemies, then by the help of the gods we shall know how to defend our lives." With this answer, Tissaphernes professed himself satisfied, and he rode away, saying, "Let there be a truce between us until I come again." 3 days afterward he again made his appearance. "It was far from easy," he said, "to dispose the king in your favor, but at last I have succeeded, and we are ready to conclude a treaty with you to this effect. You are to be allowed to pass through the king's dominions in peace, and where there is food to be bought you shall be supplied with it in exchange for your money. Where they refuse to sell it, you can take what you require. On your side, you must swear that you will act the part of friends and not enemies towards the people of the countries through which you march." These conditions having been agreed to, Tissaphernes and the Persian nobles gave their right hands to the generals and captains of the Hellenes, and all swore by the most sacred oaths that they would faithfully keep the treaty. Then Tissaphernes departed, saying, "I shall very soon bring my army to escort you on your way to Hellas, whilst I return myself to my own province." But although Tissaphernes had promised to return very shortly, day after day went by, and still he did not come. Meanwhile, there was constant communication between the king's troops and those of Ariaeus, who had sworn to be the faithful friends and allies of the Hellenes, and who were encamped beside them among the Babylonian villages. The brothers and other relations of the general rode over to see him, and in like manner all the troops of Ariaeus, down to the humblest private soldier, received and returned the visits of their friends in the king's army, which was encamped at no great distance. All this was for a purpose, and for the same purpose Tissaphernes continued to delay his coming. The king's party were anxious to sow dissension between the allies in order that the Hellenes might be utterly without friends. To this end, promises of free pardon to all subjects of the great king who would now return to their duty were diligently circulated, and Tissaphernes was careful to put off his coming so that the Persians of the king's army might have time to alienate Ariaeus and his men from their former friends. The Hellenes could not but perceive that the tone of their allies was changing rapidly, and many of them warned Clearchus that there was something wrong. "Why do we remain here?" they asked him. "Do we not know that the king wishes above all things to destroy us? To him it would be unendurable that we should reach home in safety and boast that we, a handful of Hellenes, have defeated the great king in the very heart of his empire, and have then escaped out of his hands after defying him openly. He pretends just now to be inclined for peace, but he is only waiting until all his forces are assembled, and then he will put forth his whole power to crush us." Clearchus saw the danger of their position, but it seemed to him that to go forward was even more perilous than to stay still. "If we fold up our tents and depart," he said, "the king may say that we have broken the treaty and declared war against him. Who will then give us guides to lead us through this unknown land? What other rivers may lie before us, I know not, but in any case there is the broad Euphrates, which it would be impossible to cross if an enemy were to dispute our way. It seems to me, moreover, that, if the king really meant to destroy us, he would hardly have thought it necessary to perjure himself by swearing to a treaty which he all the time intended to break." At last, after a delay of 20 days, Tissaphernes arrived with his force to escort the allied armies on their journey home. The double camp was broken up, and in 5 days they reached the Tigris, which was crossed by a bridge of boats. Soon afterward they came to some villages which belonged to Paracetus, the queen mother, and Tissaphernes, who was delighted to have the opportunity of doing her an injury, desired the Hellenes to plunder the villages. He had always envied and hated Cyrus, and, because she had done everything in her power to help her younger son, he hated Paracetus also. It gave additional zest to his revenge that her villages should be plundered by the Hellenes for whom Cyrus had always shown such marked partiality. They found them well stocked with food and were able to take away a great number of sheep and a quantity of barley. It was one of the provisions of the treaty that the Hellenes should be supplied with food. This they were able to procure by buying it in the market established in the barbarian camp. Nevertheless, their distrust of Tissaphernes was constantly on the increase, and they always marched at a prudent distance behind the barbarians, having separate guides of their own. At night, the two camps were pitched at a distance of 2 or 3 miles apart. The army of Ariaeus had by this time openly joined Tissaphernes, and now kept itself close to his force and away from the Hellenes, regardless of all the sacred oaths by which, after the battle of Cunaxa, the two armies had sworn to stand by one another and act as faithful friends and allies. We cannot but condemn the treachery of Ariaeus, and yet we must remember, as some excuse for him, the difficult position in which he was placed. For, had he remained true to the Hellenes, they would have marched together as far as Ionia, and then the Hellenes would have gone away over the sea to their own country, leaving him alone to bear the full brunt of the king's fury.